Shortly after JFK's death, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in his memory. This law is monumental in the struggle for equality. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did several things. The first thing it did was it banned discrimination based on race in employment nationwide. Employers could no longer use race as a factor when hiring. Second, it enhanced the federal power to enforce desegregation in schools and in public services. This provision on non-discrimination in the workforce is still used today for women and minorities.
The civil rights movement had always been unified around pride in the black identity. However, as African Americans faced slow progress, the movement began to split apart. African Americans had always faced two types of segregation in America. The first was de jure segregation. This is segregation ordered by law, meaning state law and federal law that separated people based on race. The second was de facto segregation. De facto segregation was not based on law, but instead by custom, habit, and tradition. With de facto segregation, blacks and whites would segregate because that's the way it had always been. The new civil rights laws passed during the movement dealt with de jure segregation, but de facto segregation still existed and was hard to fight. You would have to change the minds of people in order to eradicate de facto segregation. Angry and impatient with the lack of change, victims of de facto segregation turned to a new militancy in the civil rights movement.
Black people are dissatisfied. They're dissatisfied not only with the white man, but they're dissatisfied with these Negroes who have been sitting around here posing as leaders and spokesmen for black people and actually making the problem worse instead of making the problem better.
These African Americans lived in poverty and in the slums of urban cities. Their lives were affected by the white flight of northern cities. This is when white families moved to the suburbs and out of the cities, taking their tax revenues with them. It left all urban schools and urban housing very poor and in bad shape. The only ones left to live in the cities who couldn't afford to live in the suburbs were African Americans. The African Americans who turned to the new militancy faced police brutality, poor schools, and high unemployment rates. They lost faith in Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolence approach.
We're nonviolent with people who are nonviolent with us. But we are not nonviolent with anyone who is violent with us.
And their frustration manifested itself when riots broke out in the city of Harlem, New York, and Watts, right here in Los Angeles. In both cities, angry African Americans took to the streets. They looted stores and burnt buildings to the ground to protest the plight of injustice and discrimination in their cities. At this point, the civil rights movement now had two faces.
In 1965, the militancy faction of the movement began to gain momentum.
That I'm not going to beg the white man for anything that I deserve. I'm going to take it.
New leaders preached black power and an armed resistance. New groups began to use alternative methods to protest. This all helps to create new leaders that emerged from the movement. This new militant wing of the movement saw two new leaders rise. First was Malcolm X, and he was a member of the Nation of Islam. He preached a black separatist view that whites were the source of plight in the African American community. Because of this, he felt that blacks should live separately. Through Black Pride, he told blacks to be ready to take up arms.
It's going to be the ballot or the bullet. After we get our people registered, we can then organize that voting strength and channel it in the direction that will get immediate results for the benefit of our people. We can sweep our enemies right out of office.
Another leader of the movement was Stokely Carmichael, and he was the leader of SNCC. He taught young blacks to fight for black power, and he urged young blacks to seize the movement with militancy. He frustrated Martin Luther King Jr. and other moderate leaders who didn't want violence.
We have to make a new slogan, one people, one voice. And we have to move as a people in our neighborhood to control. We have to stop reacting and we have to become aggressive. We can no longer stand up and beg anybody for a victory or a concession. Because I'm here to tell you that if you beg a man for a victory, he gives it to you. It's his victory, not yours.
The new black power that Carmichael believed in showed itself to the world in the 1968 Summer Olympics in Mexico City. Two American athletes, who happened to be African American, raised their fists covered in black gloves on the metal podium as a sign of protest against discrimination in the United States. It was a symbol of open defiance and an incredibly powerful gesture for the civil rights movement. As the civil rights movement radicalized, a new organization called the Black Panthers organized in 1966. The Black Panthers were a militant group that advocated self-sufficiency of black communities, meaning they no longer wanted to rely on white Americans to succeed. They believed more in a separate society for blacks away from whites, because whites didn't seem to help blacks at all. The Black Panthers provided daycare, food services, and medical care in the ghettos and slums of cities. Most importantly, The Black Panthers armed themselves in order to protect themselves and black communities against police brutality. This led to several shootings between the Panthers and police, including 2 students who were shot dead in a hall at UCLA. This made them hated by whites, but incredibly popular with poor African Americans.
Black Panthers preach every day hate, kill whitey, kill the police, kill the pigs, hate, hate, hate. That's all you hear from.
We don't hate nobody because of their color. We hate oppression. We hate murder of black people in our communities.
The moderate leaders continued to preach nonviolence to achieve equality. The next phase of the movement was to protest voting rights. Determined to show nonviolence could work, Martin Luther King planned a march. MLK and other moderates descended on Selma, Alabama, which leads to the Freedom Summer and the Selma Campaign. In 1964, SNCC began a 2-year voter registration campaign in Mississippi. This Freedom Summer had college kids signing up poor blacks to vote. Some volunteers were beaten by angry whites, and some were killed. In 1965, MLK and the SCLC staged a march in Selma in support of voting rights. Like Birmingham, the campaign was attacked by whites who beat marchers. The scenes that people saw during this march led Americans to call for new laws now in order to provide equality for African Americans.
With President Lyndon Baines Johnson in office, instituting his Great Society programs, the Civil Rights Movement achieves several successes. The first is the 24th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which officially declared that poll taxes, making voters pay in order to vote, was illegal. This struck down several southern state laws keeping African Americans from voting. Another was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This law made voter literacy tests illegal and allowed federal agents to travel to southern states to ensure that African Americans could register to vote and not be intimidated by violence. The last was the Civil Rights Act of 1968. This law outlawed racial discrimination when it came to housing. You couldn't deny an African American family the right to buy a home if they were good buyers, based on their race.
With all of this new legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, LBJ understood the role that race played in American society and that the issue needed to be resolved.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Its purpose is national, not regional. Its purpose is to promote a more abiding commitment to freedom, a more constant pursuit of justice, and a deeper respect for human dignity.